We all know that test screenings are supposed to help studios gauge audience reactions. In theory, they're harmless, just a tool to fine-tune pacing, cut redundancy, maybe swap a line or two. But in the action genre, where chaos, violence, and adrenaline are currency, test screenings have sometimes done more than just polish. They've hijacked entire visions, dismantled endings, and buried the raw, unfiltered versions of stories audiences were never allowed to see. Imagine this: a brutal finale where the hero loses, a blood-soaked montage that pushes realism to the edge, or a monologue that questions everything the genre celebrates, all removed, not because they were bad, but because a group of test viewers couldn't handle the intensity. Studios panicked, directors protested, some walked away entirely, others watched their work get recut into something unrecognizable. What if your favorite action film once had a different tone? What if the gritty realism you admired was originally even darker, but the audience's discomfort killed it? These are not rumors, they're documented turning points, moments when corporate decisions erased creative intent. Sometimes it was to avoid controversy. Other times, it was pure fear. And occasionally, it was revenge. This list isn't about deleted scenes or extended cuts. It's about the battlefield behind the screen, where feedback cards and focus groups quietly reshaped what you saw in theaters. We're diving into 15 action films that weren't just edited, they were surgically altered after test screenings went horribly wrong. And in many cases, the original versions? Gone, sealed, or mysteriously missing. So buckle up. These aren't the movies you think you know. They're the versions you were never supposed to see. Let's begin. Facting Hao Yi Raw Deal 1986. Before Commando and Predator solidified Schwarzenegger's persona, there was Raw Deal, a low-budget mafia revenge story with the bones of a character study. But the version we got? All muscle, no soul? The original cut spent more time with Arnold's character as a disgraced ex-agent, showing the toll of betrayal and the cost of vengeance. There were slower scenes, long silences, and a crucial plot thread about his wife leaving him cut almost entirely from the theatrical version. The early test audience found it depressing and too European. Studio execs, terrified of tarnishing Arnold's rising brand, ordered a massive re-edit. They cranked up the body count, stripped out introspection, and added a one-liner heavy dub track. The transformation was so abrupt that even the composer had to rewrite the score to match the new pacing. To this day, no one has seen the original quiet Raw Deal. Some say it's better, some say it never should have existed. But one thing's clear: the real story was sacrificed for spectacle. Fact Jinghao R. Out for Justice, 1991. Steven Seagal's Out for Justice is often remembered as one of his most brutal roles, a detective out for vengeance after his partner is killed. But the early test version told a different story, one of self-loathing, addiction, and moral ambiguity. In the original cut, Seagal's character wasn't just a righteous avenger, he was broken. A subplot explored his struggles with alcoholism and hinted at corruption within his own precinct. But test audiences were uncomfortable seeing a Seagal character with flaws. They wanted unstoppable strength, not emotional weight. So Warner Brothers gutted the backstory. Emotional scenes were removed. Entire monologues were shortened or dubbed over. The result was a leaner, meaner film, but with a protagonist who felt more like a comic book than a cop. One editor later admitted, "We cut the best stuff because no one wanted to see Seagal cry." And that says more about audience expectations than the man himself. Fact Jinghao Sen Fair Game 1995. Cindy Crawford's one and only major action role in Fair Game was never going to win Oscars, but the original cut of the film dared to be something more complex. Instead of simply turning her into a damsel with a gun, the first version leaned heavily into psychological tension and quiet seduction. It didn't land well. Early test screenings described the film as confusing, too slow, and not sexy enough, which was ironic, given the studio had originally marketed the film on Crawford's allure. But in the raw version, her chemistry with co-star William Baldwin was intentionally awkward, built on distrust and emotional trauma, not glamorized flirtation. What happened next was a studio panic. Romantic tension was reshot to be more conventional. Dialogue was rewritten to be punchier. One scene where Crawford confronts a man who had stalked her in the past was removed entirely for being too intense. And the climactic kiss? Added in post-production based on feedback cards demanding more payoff. What could have been a messy, realistic portrayal of trauma and recovery became another by-the-numbers 90 seconds shootout fantasy. And Crawford, unfairly blamed, walked away from acting not long after. Fact hash 4. The Last Boy Scout. 1991. The Last Boy Scout already feels chaotic, but what you saw was after it had been declawed. Originally penned by Shane Black, the film was meant to be a gritty, bitter satire of toxic masculinity and corruption in sports. And the early cut? Way darker. Test audiences balked at the ending, which had Bruce Willis's character fail to stop the assassination, resulting in a media cover-up and his partner quitting in disgust. It was cynical, grim, and uncomfortably close to real scandals. Warner Brothers decided that wouldn't sell. The entire third act was reshot. The villain was given a cheesy rooftop death. A football was used as a weapon, and Willis was allowed to smirk again. Black hated the changes. Director Tony Scott clashed with producers. The result? A film that pretends to be dark while playing by safe studio rules. That original ending, once shown in a single test screening, has never reappeared. But for a brief moment, The Last Boy Scout was a film that dared to say something about America. Until America said no. 法警号无 Tango Kaz 1989. Tango and Cash should have been a slick, hard-hitting buddy cop thriller. Stallone and Kurt Russell had chemistry, the script had bite, and the original tone was closer to Lethal Weapon than Rush Hour. But then test screenings threw the whole thing into chaos. The first cut was darker, more grounded, with a prison escape sequence that included a near-assault scene, long silences, and tension instead of one-liners. The villain, played by Jack Palance, had a more methodical, terrifying presence, less cartoon, more killer. But when preview audiences labeled it too grim, Warner Brothers panicked. They rushed in a second director, cut over 15 minutes, and reshot entire scenes with slapstick humor and quippy dialogue. Stallone allegedly fought against the changes but eventually conceded under studio pressure. The result? A film that feels schizophrenic, part noir, part sitcom. And the original version? Still buried somewhere in Warner Brothers' archives, a buddy cop movie that was once about fear, not punchlines. Fact hash 6. The Face of Death. 1994. By the time Charles Bronson returned for Death Wish V, the franchise had already leaned into excess vengeance porn, over-the-top violence, and politically charged undertones. But the original cut of this fifth installment took things too far, even by its own standards. Test audiences in Toronto walked out during the film's midsection, where Bronson's character interrogates and tortures a mob enforcer in a scene described as brutal and unrelenting. The version included close-up wounds, broken fingers, and a slow, bloody demise, all presented without musical scoring. It was raw. Too raw. Canon Films, already struggling financially, panicked. They re-edited the sequence, added music, shortened the shots, and tried to soften Bronson's demeanor with ADR voiceovers hinting at morality, but the damage was done. Critics still panned the film, but few realized how much worse or better it once was. The uncut version has never surfaced, and Bronson himself reportedly referred to it as a scene that never should have been filmed. But others disagree. Some say it was the last moment the Death Wish series had any real teeth. Facting Hao Qi Eraser 1996. By the mid-90 seconds, CGI was creeping into action cinema, and Eraser, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, wanted to ride the wave. But in doing so, it erased more than enemies. It erased its own brutality. The original version was packed with practical effects. Squib hits, blood packs, close-range kills that hit hard. But test screenings flagged the violence as excessive and too real. Several sequences, especially one involving a shootout in a meat locker, were flagged as upsetting. Viewers complained not about the action, but about its intimacy. Warner Brothers made a radical call: digitally remove much of the blood, and in some cases, replace squib shots with CGI sparks. This decision, rushed and inconsistent, left the final film feeling oddly sanitized. Stunt coordinator Mike Rogers later called it a gut punch to the craft. Ironically, fans now mock Eraser for its fake-looking VFX. But few realize the studio chose visual comfort over physical consequence. The real carnage was on the editing floor. Fact Hasheit, Harley-Davidson and the Marlboro Man, 1991. This cult oddity blended neo-Western aesthetics with futuristic crime and an absurd amount of product placement. Mickey Rourke and Don Johnson played outlaws in a not-quite dystopian L.A., but the early version of Harley-Davidson and the Marlboro Man had one thing the final cut lacked: a soul. Test screenings targeted the film's introspective tone. In the original cut, characters talked philosophy between gunfights. There were moments of doubt, guilt, and existential dread. One monologue reportedly likened capitalism to slow suicide, a risky move for a film named after brands. Audiences didn't get it. Comments included too talky, confusing tone, and less thinking, more shooting. The studio obliged. Dialogues were axed. An entire subplot about veterans struggling with PTSD vanished, and the ending, once a melancholy parting of ways, was changed to a cheesy freeze frame of macho victory. Rourke never spoke of the film again. Don Johnson dismissed it as a paycheck wrapped in leather. But those who saw the early version say it played more like a broken western than an action flick, and that may have been its biggest strength. Fact #9. The Presidio, 1988. On paper, the Presidio had everything: Sean Connery, Mark Harmon, military conspiracies, and San Francisco set pieces. But beneath its sleek exterior, the film suffered a quiet execution, its original ending removed after test audiences laughed at the wrong moment. The first cut reportedly ended with Connery's character facing off with a corrupt general in a tense courtroom-style confession scene. It was quiet, dialogue-driven, and morally layered. But test viewers expected explosions, not ethical dilemmas. One comment card read, "Boring. Where's the action?" Another simply said, "Too much talking." Paramount panicked. The ending was scrapped in favor of a chase and shootout finale, complete with car crashes and dramatic one-liners. The political tension was diluted. Connery's performance, once nuanced and restrained, was trimmed into a caricature of stoic badassery. The original ending has never been seen again. Even the screenwriter, Larry Ferguson, later admitted, "We had something smarter, but it wasn't what they wanted." So what was the Presidio, really? A mystery wrapped in a gunfight, or a missed opportunity for depth? Fact: Desat. Cobra tisit devetsto osemdesiatchest. Cobra should have been Sylvester Stallone's gritty masterpiece. What began as a slow-burn atmospheric crime story ended up as a 90-minute action montage because the original version scared its own producers. Stallone played a rogue cop hunting a cult of axe-wielding serial killers. But early test audiences found the film too sadistic. The night slasher's backstory, which included scenes of ritualistic murder and childhood abuse, was axed. A graphic hospital sequence, where a nurse is stalked through shadow and blood, was trimmed to near incomprehension. More notably, Stallone's own character was deeper in the original. Emotionally scarred, obsessed with justice, barely holding it together. The test screening labeled him too cold, too damaged. The studio ordered cuts to make him likable. The result? A shallower character, a faster pace, and a film stripped of its psychological tension. Rumors of a director's cut still swirl, but Warner Brothers has never acknowledged its existence. Some insiders say it was destroyed. Others claim it was locked away because the full version was simply too brutal to survive 1986's box office climate. And maybe that's the real crime. Fact: Hashan1. The package, 1989. The package was billed as a political thriller with action leanings, but its early cut told a far more violent and controversial story. Directed by Andrew Davis, The Fugitive, the film followed a U.S. military sergeant uncovering an assassination plot tied to global arms deals. But the test screening revealed a problem. Audiences weren't just shocked, they were alarmed. The original version portrayed corrupt generals orchestrating mass manipulation of foreign policy through targeted killings. One character openly questioned American militarism, prompting audiences to label it unpatriotic and anti-American. In addition, the violence was stark and clinical. A Pentagon shooting scene, later deleted, drew the most ire. Under pressure, Orion Pictures dialed it back. Dialogue was softened. The military critique was buried under action scenes. And the most politically explosive material? Cut, sealed, and never spoken of again. Davis, ever the professional, didn't protest, but he never revisited the topic either. If that cut had been released, the package might have stood alongside 3 Days of the Condor. Instead, it became just another thriller that flinched. Fact: Shibi. Bestseller Chungubek Parshipcher. James Woods and Brian Dennehy anchored Bestseller, a sharp neo-noir thriller that toyed with morality and manipulation. The story followed a police officer turned author being seduced intellectually and ethically by a charming assassin. But if you found the ending oddly safe, you're not imagining things. The original cut featured a quiet, unsettling conclusion. Dennehy's character, having helped bring down a criminal empire, watches Woods's hitman disappear into obscurity. No big shootout, no redemption, just ambiguity. The scene was reportedly met with confusion and disappointment at the test screening. Viewers wanted closure, not subtlety. The studio, fearing poor box office returns, ordered a new ending louder, bloodier, and morally clearer. They added a final confrontation, inserted more gunfire, and implied the assassin got what was coming to him. The change was surgical and strategic, but it dulled the edge. Director John Flynn later called the decision cowardice in the face of complexity. Woods, in interviews, hinted that the original finale was his favorite scene in the film. It's now lost, never released on home media, never leaked, just a shadow of a darker truth. Fact: Hajan 3. The Glimmer Man, 1996. Steven Seagal isn't known for subtlety, but The Glimmer Man was supposed to be different. A dark, psychological thriller with violent spiritual undertones. The original cut leaned into its serial killer storyline, showing victims posed in ritualistic ways, and even giving Seagal's character moments of inner conflict over his past as a government assassin turned Buddhist. But then came the test screenings. Audience feedback called the film too creepy, slow, and not what Seagal fans expected. The studio recoiled. Key scenes were pulled, including a gruesome sequence where a victim is discovered crucified in a church. The villain's backstory, originally involving religious obsession and self-harm, was removed. What remained was a neutered action film that felt tonally confused. Seagal, reportedly furious, refused to promote the theatrical cut. Co-star Keenan Ivory Wayans called it a thriller trapped inside a Seagal movie. The original editor even hinted that the first version was closer to 7 than above the law. Today, that footage is locked away, unreleased. But fragments survive in early scripts and promotional stills, just enough to suggest that the Glimmer Man once had teeth before it was forced to smile. Fact 井号14 Dead Heat 1988. A zombie cop comedy with noir undertones and splatter horror visuals sounds bizarre enough. But Dead Heat was originally even stranger and bleaker. The film starred Treat Williams and Joe Piscopo as detectives caught in a conspiracy involving reanimated corpses used for organized crime hits. Sounds wild? The first cut was worse. According to editor Stephen Cohen, the early version leaned hard into horror, longer scenes of decomposition, a bloodier resurrection chamber, and an ending where both protagonists rot in real time, fully conscious of their fate. Test audiences were reportedly disturbed, not entertained. The horror overpowered the humor. Reactions were so negative, the studio panicked. Result: scenes were sliced for tone, punchlines were forcibly inserted, and the brutal ending was replaced with a let's go out smiling finale. The darker elements, the commentary on mortality, the existential dread were gone. Director Mark Goldblatt later called the recut a compromise born of desperation. The irony? That original tone is now in vogue. Grim, satirical horror comedy thrives today. But back then, Dead Heat was just too dead to be funny. Fact Shibo. Stone Cold. Chungubek Shibil. Imagine a movie so intense that test audiences asked to leave before it ended. That's exactly what happened with Stone Cold, the 1991 biker action fever dream starring NFL linebacker turned actor Brian Bosworth. The original cut was nearly 2 hours long, drenched in ultra-violence and laced with a nihilistic tone that made even hardened viewers squirm. Directed by Craig R. Baxley, Stone Cold followed an undercover cop infiltrating a white supremacist biker gang. But the version that reached theaters was missing over 30 minutes entire action sequences, character deaths, and even a different ending. Test audiences had complained of excessive cruelty, emotional detachment, and no sense of redemption. The studio responded with the cinematic equivalent of a fire hose slashing the runtime, trimming the gore, and adding safer transitions. The fallout? Baxley distanced himself from the final cut. Rumors persist that the original climax involved Bosworth's character being killed off in a morally ambiguous shootout cut because it left viewers angry and confused. That footage? Never released. No director's cut. No leak. Just whispers from those who saw the test version and never forgot how much sharper, stranger, and darker it had once been. And if Stone Cold had remained in its raw form, it might have been more than a cult relic. It might have been a genre rupture. The Killers, 1994. This one didn't make the top 15, but it might just be the strangest of all. In 1994, a television remake of The Killers starring Johnny Depp, Gabrielle Anwar, and a then-rising Matthew Lillard, was produced under NBC's action thriller division. Based loosely on the Hemingway-inspired 1946 noir, this version was pitched as a hard-hitting modern update with government assassins, experimental weapons, and a body count to rival The Terminator. But after one disastrous test screening, the project didn't just get recut, it got buried. Attendees reported graphic executions, torture scenes involving electric shock, and a chilling finale where the protagonist is assassinated on live television. Reactions weren't just negative, they were panicked. Parents wrote to NBC saying the content was psychologically damaging. A studio exec later called the screening the biggest mistake we ever allowed. NBC shelved the film before it ever aired. No official VHS or DVD release followed. Some claim the full version was destroyed. Others say it lives in a private archive, its violence too shocking, its message too bleak for prime time. The irony? In a post-Breaking Bad, post-John Wick era, The Killers, 1994, might have been celebrated for its uncompromising tone. Instead, it's the rare action film that never even had the chance to fail because it was deemed too dangerous to be seen. Which version would you rather see, the polished product that made it to theaters, or the raw, volatile cuts the studios tried to erase? Test screenings were meant to refine. Instead, they rewrote endings, buried messages, and neutered films that might have hit harder than we were ready for. So tell us in the comments, which of these lost versions do you think deserve to survive? And more importantly, do you trust the audience or the filmmaker?